no matter what mode of transportation you choose, there's danger involved. So, more danger than when you're not traveling. So you need to have a good election chart for the start of your journey, which begins when your first bag leaves your wherever you're stationed, which will usually be a house, but it may be also an apartment. But when the first bag leaves the doorway to go on the journey, which often, of course, the first bag is going on a very short journey to the trunk of the vehicle, but that's still the start of the journey. That then is when the demigods say that the trip has begun. So in election astrology, you want to have knowledge of what is the lugna, which means the ascendant, and you want to have good planets in the quadrants as much as possible. You want to have the Lord of the lugna strong. You want to have a very solidified, prominent moon. There's so many different rules that you want to try to get as much as possible. And then there's some very subtle rules and some very complicated rules. I have a whole chapter on election astrology in my book, Course Sidereal Astrology, where I discuss much of this. Election astrology, once it's understood how important it is, an individual will reach the stage that on any major undertaking, he or she will not do it unless the chart is first drawn up. And sometimes you will have a small space of time, such as the whole day can be whittled down to a 4-minute period that you have to make this move on, because everything else has some major element to it that's very either an obstacle or awkward or dangerous. And it will come down to knowing those 4 minutes, of which case, like for example, I've made 2 trips recently, one trip to Utah and one trip to Little Rock. And on both occasions, particularly the one to Utah, I actually waited. I was ready to go. Everything was lined up, and I waited about an hour, just waiting for that time to take place, when it was a very small time. And I tried to get as many of my bags in the vehicle as possible in that small space of time. But the first bag did go out at the beginning of that time. Now, on the recent trip to Little Rock, as it so happened, I got everything organized 1 minute before I was to leave. So it was like, whoa, 1 minute left. And then I just stood at the door, inside the door, looked at my cell phone. When it clipped over, picked up the bag, and we started. So, to me, major travels, you're just going into town. Even when I go into town, I astrologically take a look and try to get sun in the 11th, for example, which you can get once a day. You can get sun in the 11th. Now, right now, sun in the 11th is not too important because sun's debilitated. But when sun's not debilitated, to put sun in the 11th, it's a good placement. You'd want that.
Can you tell us a bit about Ayanamshas? What are they? What's the controversy, and why do you feel you've made a contribution to the discussion and understanding of Ayanamsha?
Ayanamsha is a somewhat complicated topic, and we've touched on it previously. The difference between the length of the tropical year and the sidereal year is small, and it amounts approximately to 54 seconds of sidereal arc per year. The sidereal year is slightly longer than the tropical year. In other words, the sun, let us use the 0 point of Aries, the beginning of Aries. The sun will reach the beginning of Aries each year a little bit longer than it will take for it to reach the same point of, say, vernal equinox if they were aligned, which they aren't aligned. It's a conception that you have to work on a little bit to get. But the point is that when the sun comes each year to its point of, say, vernal equinox on March 22nd, sometimes the 21st, then it takes a little bit longer time before it reaches, on the same day usually, the point in the zodiac where that was the previous year. So that is called the precession of the equinoxes. That in around 400 AD, and that's also another approximation, the sun was at 0 degrees Aries when it was also the vernal equinox. But because of this difference in the length of the sidereal and tropical year, there's been a precession, a backwards movement, so that right now the sun is at approximately in the neighborhood of 7 to 8 degrees of Pisces when it comes to the vernal equinox. When it used to be, way back in antiquity, circa 400 AD, it was at 0 degrees Aries. It has moved back, and that's called the precession of the equinox. Now, where the controversy is what is the length of that Ayanamsha? Is it real long or is it short? There's many different Ayanamshas. Lahiri had an Ayanamsha. B.V. Raman had a different Ayanamsha. Yukteswar had a different Ayanamsha. J.N. Vasin had a different Ayanamsha. Fagan had a different Ayanamsha. There are many different Ayanamshas. I'm giving an Ayanamsha that's quote-unquote quite short. It's even shorter than Raman's. And Ayanamsha is important because you are going to place your planets based on the Ayanamsha. Your planets are going to be placed in certain parts, in certain signs, and certain vargas or subdivisions of those signs, and the Ayanamsha will determine which vargas the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu are placed at.
You mentioned in your preface to the book, you talked about your own personal journey in your studies of astrology. You said you began in 1978. That was 30 years ago. What's the major difference between what you understand now and what you thought you understood then?
First of all, some of the teaching I received didn't bear up to my research proving it to be right or wrong. So the basics, the A, B, C, D, were given correctly. But as you got a little deeper into the alphabet, I found that some things are not quite right. Ayanamsha that I received at that time, I eventually gave up as being far too long, and that's of course the Lahiri Ayanamsha. I do not believe in the Lahiri Ayanamsha, that it's accurate. It's too long. Also, being able to understand certain truths and applications, especially in terms of election astrology, I was not taught at that time. Election astrology is something that I was self-taught in, basically, although B.V. Raman's book called Muhurta was extremely helpful to me. I can give full credit there, but it still was a self-taught process. The importance of election astrology was not taught to me in the beginning. So comparing then to now would be like comparing, perhaps Pony League to being in the majors.
You talk about occupational options. That's one of the chapters in your book. I take it from that if one understands his astrological chart, he understands better what his occupational, his what he should do for a living and the general direction in life. What does that chapter cover, occupational options?
It covers pretty much what you're talking about. You can make a mistake and enter into an occupation that astrologically you're not qualified for, and that you don't have good karma for, and that you will almost certainly fail in, or even if you don't fail, you will never be a success in. That's bad karma due to illusion. So in that chapter I strip off all those illusions. Now, there are some combinations, and I actually personally have one of those, which I call, it's never been called this that I know of, but I call it the jack of all trades planetary position. If you have some of those, if you have excellent planets in the 11th and the 2nd, you can have such a good karma for an income stream that it's not very important